If you've been scrolling through endless tower speaker lists, listening to the same best-of videos, and still feel stuck between big, boomy sound and clean, detailed audio, you're not alone. The decision feels even heavier when you factor in the size of the room, the type of music you love, and whether you'll be using these speakers for movies, games, or a home theater mix. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this review, I'll walk through the everyday reality of living with the SVS Ultra Evolution Titan Towers, so you can see if the hype actually lines up with the experience you'll get on a typical weeknight binge or a Saturday morning vinyl session. First off, let's talk about what the Titan is trying to do. It's a three-way tower that packs four 6.5-inch woofers arranged in a force-balanced opposed array, a mid-range driver, and a tweeter that sits on an aircraft-grade aluminum dome coated in diamond carbon. On paper that sounds like a recipe for thunderous bass and surgical highs, but the real question is how that translates when the speaker is standing in the corner of a medium-sized living room versus a larger open-plan space. I set up a pair in my 20-square-meter family room, placing them on sturdy stands about a foot off the floor, angled just enough to point toward the listening spot on the sofa. The first thing I noticed was the way the cabinet feels solid without being over-engineered. SVS used FEAoptimized bracing and acoustic insulation, and that shows up as a noticeably tighter bass response. When I hit low-frequency passages in classic rock, think the opening of Whole Lotta Love, the bass is deep enough to feel, but it doesn't turn the room into a shaking box. The quad woofer array seems to distribute the low end evenly, so you get that room-filling vibe without the rattling you sometimes hear with cheaper large towers. For movies, the Titan really shines in the rumble department. A quick test with an action film's explosion sequence gave me that visceral impact you want without sacrificing dialogue clarity. The mid-range driver, tucked between the woofers and tweeter, holds up surprisingly well when the soundtrack switches to a quiet conversation. The acoustically centered architecture that SVS touts appears to keep the soundstage cohesive, voices stay anchored to the screen, and the surrounding effects feel like they're coming from the right places, not just from the left and right speakers. Now, what about music? I'm a fairly eclectic listener, moving from jazz to EDM. When I put on a live jazz recording, the piano and upright bass sit nicely together. The composite glassfiber cone on the woofers has a good stiffness-to-miss ratio, which translates into a controlled, responsive low end that doesn't get overly boomy. On the other hand, when I crank up a high-energy EDM track, the Titan's high-frequency response stays clean, thanks to that diamond carbon-coated dome on the tweeter. The highs cut through without sounding harsh, and the overall sound stays balanced, even at higher volumes. Who should consider these speakers? If you already own a decent AV receiver that can drive a 4-ohm load comfortably, and you have a room that can accommodate a 4-foot-tall tower, the Titan is a solid upgrade from entry-level bookshelf models. They're especially appealing if you enjoy a mix of movies, gaming, and music, and you want a single pair that can handle the dynamic range of each without needing a subwoofer for most everyday listening. People who love to sit close to the speakers like a dedicated listening chair a few feet away will appreciate the focused mid-range and the way the bass stays tight rather than overwhelming the mids. On the flip side, there are scenarios where the Titan might not be the best fit. First, if you live in a very small apartment where the speakers would dominate the floor space, you might find the three-way design a bit excessive. The bottom end, while controlled, can still be more powerful than a typical small room setup needs, leading to a slightly busy low-frequency region if the room isn't treated with rugs or curtains. Second, the price point is positioned in the higher-end tier of SVS's lineup, so if you're on a strict budget, a well-reviewed SVS Prime Tower could give you respectable performance for less money. Finally, the Titan's aesthetic black oak finish with a fairly modern silhouette might not blend with a more traditional core, so visual integration could be a consideration. Practical strengths stand out once you start using the speakers daily. The first is the bass control. Because the woofers are arranged in that opposed array, they cancel out each other's unwanted vibrations, meaning you get a clean low end that doesn't muddy the mids. The second strength is the seamless transition between drivers. In many three-way designs, you can hear a step when the music moves from the woofer to the mid-range, but the Titan's acoustically centered architecture keeps the crossover smooth, so the sound feels like one continuous flow. Lastly, the build quality, particularly the internal bracing, helps reduce cabinet resonance, which becomes obvious after a few weeks of listening to bass-heavy tracks. Weaknesses are subtler but